Hello, welcome to our Introduction to Personality Theory course. And in this video, we continue studying social and cultural domain. In last video, we started to discuss the topic of so-called sex differences and discussed main research findings in this area. In this video, we will continue this topic and we'll dive in and we'll consider other important concepts such as gender, sexual identity, and sexual orientation. So those concepts are very well researched nowadays. So each couple of years, we get a lot of groundbreaking research findings, which completely change our understanding of sex, gender, sexual identity, and sexual orientation. So we should pay a lot of attention to this area of studies because in upcoming years, probably this tendency will continue and we will get a lot of new, exciting, and super interesting results about how everything actually works. So in this video, we will try to discuss what is gender and how we define it. So what is femininity and masculinity and how people historically understood those concepts. So what are gender stereotypes exist and how they work? What is gender identity and how it develops? And finally, we will come to a logical conclusion as always. So the concept of gender is very hard to define because our understanding of what gender is actually changes throughout the time. So current version of American Psychological Association dictionary has this big, long definition. So let's try to read it and understand what's important here. So gender is the condition of being male, female, or neuther. In a human context, the distinction between gender and sex reflects the usage of these terms. Sex usually refers to the biological aspects of maleness or femaleness, whereas gender implies the psychological, behavioral, social, and cultural aspects of being male or female. So sex here in this context and how psychologists usually use this concept refers to biological aspects, right? Genetical factors, physiological differences, hormonal differences, and so on, while gender refers more to psychological, behavioral, and social aspects, which is not the same. So the same biological realities can be treated and evaluated differently on a social level, right? So it means that in different cultures and in different historical periods, people considered sex differences a different way. So, and the views on gender are heavily influenced by both culture and historical period we live in. So those social factors influence internal psychological understanding of what our gender is and what genders of other people are, and results in certain types of behavior, which would be considered appropriate or inappropriate in this culture, in this society, in this historical period of time. So the main thing here is to distinguish sex as a biological aspects and gender as social and psychological aspects. So here we need to mention the concept of femininity and masculinity, which were understood very differently in different historical times. In psychology, so one of the most important authors on this topic were Janet Spence and Sandra Bem, who in second half of the 20th century published several groundbreaking articles and books on this topic. So first, they proposed the idea that masculinity and femininity is not a single continuum. So before them, people usually saw femininity and masculinity as a single continuum on which femininity and masculinity are two poles, and all people can be placed somewhere between those poles, and preferably to be closer to the pole which is associated with your biological sex. So culturally speaking, people thought that if you was born female, you should show masculinity and should be close to this side of the spectrum. If you were born as biological female, you should be closer to a spectrum of femininity. So Spence and Bern said, hey, probably it's two independent continuums. So there is a continuum of masculinity and continuum of femininity. And you can score high on both, or you can score low on both, not showing signs of both femininity and masculinity. And thus they are introduced the concept of androgynous people. Androgynous people who score high both on femininity and masculinity, so showing those associated traits, behavioral patterns, and emotional reactions associated with both genders, which people thought existed as a theory. But time passed, and a lot of new pieces of research were published, and slowly Janet Spence and Sandra Bem slightly changed their mind in their views on masculinity and femininity. It's actually very interesting to track their evolution of their ideas in history of psychology. So, for example, Janet Spence no longer believes that their test questionnaire assesses sex roles as they thought initially. Now she supposes it measures two different personality characteristics: instrumentality and expressiveness. So instrumentality consists of personality traits that involve working with objects, getting tasks completed, direct fashion, showing independence from others, and displaying self-sufficiency. So people who are not very oriented toward relationships and oriented toward working with objects and achieving results. So previously it was associated with masculinity in a gender aspect. Now Janet Spence supposes it's just a personality trait of instrumentality. Personality trait of expressiveness, in contrast, is the ease with which one can express emotions, showing empathy, and showing nurturance to people who are in need. So idea is that people who high on expressiveness, very oriented toward relationships, they have high motivation of affiliation, they have interest in showing empathy, developing emotional intelligence, and communication skills. And they consider this as the most important. So this is an interesting shift, right, from gender sex roles to personality characteristics, actually quite a shift. So for Sandra Bem, evolution of their ideas is different. So she now suppose that their initial test questionnaire of femininity and masculinity now assesses gender schemas, not sex roles. So gender schema is this cognitive orientation that leads individuals to process social information on the basis of sex-linked association. So it's learned, right? It's a cognitive orientation, like a lens or glasses through which we perceive reality, ourselves and other people. And in this sense, society's belief about traits like which females and males should show influence our gender schema. We learn from society how it should look like. it influences the processing of social information. So using your gender schemas, you use this as a tool to perceive how other people behave, and that's how you see them, that all people have certain gender, and they should manifest behavior culturally and socially associated with their gender. If you see that it's not the case, you start to think that something is wrong. And finally, gender schema also influence our self-esteem. So we start to evaluate our thoughts and behaviors. Do they match those social and cultural interpretations, ideas, how we should behave and think and feel? And basically, if you fit those societal expectations, you feel good. If you don't fit them, you feel bad. So gender schema works like that. It's a very interesting concept, more developed. So Bell suggested that like their inventory questionnaire specifically assesses the extent to which individuals live according to and see the world through gender schemas, right? So some people will have different gender schemas based on what you will consider to be right and wrong and how you specifically were taught, right? So if actually it's is easy to see based on how different generations of people describe what is femininity, masculinity, and gender. So if we will ask people from silent generation or baby boomers, they basically perceive gender usually as a binary concept. So there are like males and females, femininity and masculinity, and strictly associated with certain job occupations, certain types of hobbies and activities, certain clothing, certain patterns of behavior, and certain patterns of communication. But if you will ask, for example, Generation Z people about gender, they will tell you a completely different story about how gender is non-binary construct, and there are several dozens of different genders, and people can dress and behave whenever they like, because it just should be like comfortable and convenient. And most of them don't see strict connection between like your biological sex and how you should dress, behave, and where you should work. And it's completely different, like social and cultural narrative about sex. So gender schemas would be very different for people from different generations, and it also would be different for people from different cultures, right? Because in Middle East countries, gender schemas would be completely different from, for example, Northern Europe, right? So Northern Europe, like Scandinavian countries, associated with highest level of gender equality in workforce, while, for example, Middle East countries like characterized by severe like gender separation. So and gender schemas would be completely different. So it brings us to the concept of gender stereotypes. So stereotypes are, and gender stereotypes, it's relatively fixed, overly simplified concepts of the attitudes and behaviors are considered normal and appropriate for male, female in particular culture. So gender stereotypes often support the social conditioning of gender roles. So we should pay attention to the ideas that stereotypes often do not reflect the reality, and they often like not fair, right? Often we use the concept of stereotype in a negative sense, right? Stereotypes are bad. You shouldn't overly simplify, judge any people based on their group, the group they belong to. You should like assess all people individually based on their individual merit, not on the basis of the group they belong to. So, and it's true, but all people use stereotypes because evolutionary speaking, they were adaptive. because they saved us a lot of time on thinking process. So basically, the function of stereotype is to save you time and energy. You don't turn on multi-stage thinking process because it's time and energy consuming. You just use stereotype as a simple heuristic to come to this conclusion very fast. But this conclusion might be completely inaccurate. So this is what we should understand. So all stereotypes and gender stereotypes specifically consist from three main components. So the first component is a cognitive. So all stereotypes include some idea, right? There are many negative stereotypes and there are some positive stereotypes, but all of them are not very good in this sense. So the examples of cognitive sides of gender stereotypes would be some ideas that, for example, and again, I do not agree with those ideas, but it's an example of stereotypes. So, for example, that men are better in fixing, I don't know, technical devices, while females are better in communication, right? It's an idea of gender stereotype. There is an affective component, so emotions connected to this. So when we use stereotypes, we feel certain emotion, right? It may be hatred or like anxiety, or it may be positive emotions, right? But all stereotypes connected with a certain feelings. And finally, they result in certain behavior. So you start to act based on your stereotypes, for example, discriminating certain people. So because you completely believe, both on cognitive and emotional level, that your ideas are true. So for example, in stereotype, we said about like men fixing things and women are showing empathy. You wouldn't hire a man for a job position of psychotherapist, and you wouldn't hire female for the position of like repairs worker. It would be discrimination based on stereotypes of behavioral consequence of this. So what we know about like research on stereotypes? Actually, Williams and Best conducted like a huge study on gender stereotypes in 30 countries. Though this research is relatively old, but we need to discuss it anyways. So in all countries, results were kind of similar, though absolute numbers were different, but the direction of like stereotyping was similar. So according to stereotypes, again, it's stereotypes, not the reality, right? It's not the same. So men were commonly viewed as more aggressive, autonomous, achievement-oriented, dominant, exhibitionistic, and persevering. So than women. Women were more commonly seen as more affiliative, deferent, nurturant, and self-abasing. It's a classical gender stereotypes about like aggressive, ambitious men and nurturing, caring, emotional women. Again, it doesn't reflect the reality, it reflects stereotypes most of people share, which can work as a self-fulfilling prophecy in some societies, because people clearly want to fit into societal expectations. And if they feel that it's expected to behave in a certain way, most of people show obedience and do what society tells them to do, even if it's a bad thing. So gender stereotypes have this like common theme. Women perceive it as more communal, while men perceive it as more agentic. Though, again, on the individual level, it doesn't mean anything. So if we will take two random people, they can be completely different and don't fit in any stereotypes at all. So stereotyping definitely doesn't help much, but still, again, because it's evolutionary adaptive probably we will never get rid out of gender stereotypes. Our task is to make people more self-aware about the fact that gender stereotypes exist and how actually we should treat them. So the concept of gender identity is relatively new to psychology. So for a long time, people just thought that, yeah, hey, you have gender, that's enough. But nowadays, we understand that gender and gender identity is not the same, which makes situation even more complicated. So basically, gender identity is a personal sense of your own gender. So how do you feel like who you are? So APA offers a longer definition. Gender identity is self-identification as a male or female, although the dominant approach in psychology for many years have been to regard gender identity as residing in individuals. The important influence of societal structures, cultural expectations, and personal interactions in its development is now recognized as well. Significant evidence now exists to support the conceptualization of gender identity as influenced by both environmental and biological factors. So what is interesting, even American Psychological Association dictionary uses this binary stuff like male or female. So technically speaking, now we know that you can identify whenever you like, and there are many dozens of possible gender identities you might have. So including feeling both male and female, or neither, like non-binary people, or like agender. Non-binary people feel gender identity, but it doesn't strictly belong to like a male or female. So technically speaking, there are many variations. So nowadays we have long lists of possible gender identities, and more research is published on this topic. So even our like best dictionaries and textbooks in this area become obsolete very fast, and I wanted to comment on this. So you should be very careful with all the materials of this topic, because again, they get obsolete like surprisingly quickly. So the idea is just that gender and gender identity do not always coincide. The same way as gender not necessarily strictly connected with your biological sex, which creates a lot of possible combinations. What is interesting, those relationships, right? So some people have gender identities that matches their like sex and gender, and it's we usually call them cisgender people. So for them, everything is relatively easy because everything matches. So their biological sex matches with their gender and matches their gender identity. So they feel less problems in this area. They basically face less oppression or possible social misunderstanding, and they have enough acknowledgement and represented in mass culture. So transgender people, it's people whose gender identity and gender expression not corresponds with the sex they had from birth, right? So basically, they feel different from the biological sex they have, and they can't have any gender at this point. So it makes everything much more complicated in terms of like everyday life for those people. And actually, research shows that at least 0.5% of people in Canada are transgender people. Probably in future, we will see that the number can be actually higher. Why do I think so? Because still even in Canada, the country which is famous for being more tolerant and progressive than many other countries in the world, transgender individuals experience a lot of discrimination and oppression, both verbally and physically, which is actually disturbing. So it's kind of, those people don't always feel safe to report and openly express their gender identity. And I think in a more safe environment where everyone is encouraged to share their gender identities without fear of being oppressed or abused or discriminated, we will see that actual number of transgender people can be actually higher. I don't know how much higher, so I don't think it would be like 10% of people. So the difference probably shouldn't be like in dozens of times, but it should be higher. So though it actually kind of a lot. So it's many hundreds of thousands of people in Canada only. And if we will think about like 0.5, even 0.5% of world population, it would be more than 45 million of people at least, probably much more, which is actually more than population of Canada. So it would be a big country. So unfortunately, those people still face a lot of oppression and discrimination. So modern research shows that transgender identity is absolutely normal. So for some time, a lot of people still have the stereotypes that it's being transgender person, it's some kind of a disorder, or it's wrong or abnormal. It's not true. So the research actually shows no, it's completely normal. But because of stereotypes and political agendas, so those people still don't receive equal treatment, which is bad, and we should change this situation in future. One more concept very closely related to this topic is actually sexual orientation. And again, what is surprising for many people, gender identity is actually not connected with your sexual orientation. So sexual orientation is enduring pattern of romantic or sexual attraction to people of any gender, basically. So it's to whom you feel sexually and romantically attracted. And because we have several possible genders and gender identities and sexes, you can be attracted to very different groups of people, which actually creates a long list of possible sexual orientations, which also kind of contradict our simplistic historical narrative on this topic, because like in previous times, people thought that everything is very easy. There are two biological sexes, two genders, and two sexual orientations. So heterosexual people who are considered to be normal, and all other people who consider to be abnormal and unhealthy. So you should just fit in this strict rule. Actually, now we know that no, it's not true. Everything is more complicated and everything is normal. So basically, this is the difference between like old historical view, which is actually still the main way how a lot of people taught in schools in many countries, and the new way, what we know based on recent research. So let's try to look. This picture represents so-called old view, how people historically viewed the relationships between sex, gender, and sexual orientation. So for a long period of time, people thought that there are only two biological sexes, male and female. If you're like a male, you will become masculine and develop male gender and male gender identity. If you're female, you will develop femininity and female gender and gender identity, and biological males attracted to biological females attracted to biological males. It's not norm as heterosexuality. Homosexuality is some sort of deviation according to this view, disorder which should be treated, and so on. Actually, since 1973, American Psychiatric Association excluded homosexuality from the list of disorders because they didn't find any evidence which can show that it should be considered as a disorder, and they propose that it's a norm. After that, it caused a lot of reaction in different countries of the world, but eventually in 1990, World Health Organization, WHO, also excluded homosexuality from the list of disorders in their international classification of disorders. And since then, like, it's a common consensus in scientific communities that homosexuality, other types of sexual orientations should be considered as a normality. Though in many countries in the world, social policies is still very obsolete and perceive reality in this way. So modern views on sex, gender, and sexuality looks like that. So we know that there are actually 3 biological sexes. So male, female, and so-called intersex people. So intersex people are born with features which cannot be strictly categorized as male or female. For example, chromosome sex can be XY, like male, but with certain medical conditions, those people can have breasts and vagina. So how would you classify such people? They have male chromosome sex, but like biologically, like on appearance, it looks like a female. So those people cannot be classified strictly, and now it's called intersex. There are different categories of people who can fall in this category of intersex people. So if you're interested, you can search additional information on this topic. It's actually quite fascinating. And intersex people actually is about 1.5% of world population. So it's around 150 millions of people all over the world. It can be in top 10 countries by population in the world. So there are a lot of such people. So genders and gender identities. Now we actually know that there are a lot of genders. I cannot even provide you with the exact number of genders because there are different competing theories about how we should classify them. But what we know for sure, gender is not strictly connected with biological sex, and there are definitely more than 2 genders. And sexual orientations finally also exist in abundance. So there are less sexual orientations than genders, but still a lot. Which includes like homosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, and many others, asexuality, and so on. So all of them are considered to be variation of norm, and they're not connected not only to biological sex, but to gender and gender identity as well. So that's why on this schema, there is no arrows connecting this. So technically speaking, all of those parameters are relatively independent. And though statistically, the majority of people still fits in a classical like way of alignment between biological sex, gender, and gender identity and sexual orientation, huge chunk of the population actually doesn't fit. So we know that at least 1.5% of people are intersex people. We know that up to 10% of people are not heterosexual in terms of sexual orientation. And it's hard to provide the exact number of people who don't identify as just like male or female in terms of gender and gender identity. But so we're still speaking about dozens and possibly hundreds of millions of people all over the world. And actually, it works way more complicated than we initially saw. So this area of studies actually, as I said and mentioned previously, is very fast developing. So we should be aware that we need to read information on this topic each year, update, and probably we will see a lot of other groundbreaking research findings that will change our views on sexual orientation, gender, and maybe even biological sex. So speaking about those sex and gender differences, so psychologists usually use combinations of explanations like why we are different. So some psychologists focus on social factors, for example, like social learning and social theory, role theories. So social factors is basically culture and how we teach children, right? So those psychologists emphasize the importance of social practices, expectations, and learning from adults. And the idea is that children like just want to be obedient and want to fit into social expectations. So they read those social expectations very fast, even though if those expectations are not verbally formed and exist in the form of tacit rules. So children are also very sensitive and they read it and do this. So psychologists who focus on biological factors try to explain the difference between sexes and emergence of different sexual orientations and genders through like hormonal theories, underlining the importance of hormonal balance in people, including pregnancy and how it might affect a fetus, and evolutionary theories, so how, like evolutionary speaking, it can be helping to adapt and survive, and maybe we can trace some signs of how it developed, like evolutionary speaking, because maybe it provided us, our ancestors, with certain advantages. So most complex theories, of course, include all the explanations, both from biological and social factors, but they're quite complicated and there are a lot of debates about which factors are actually more important. So if you remember in the last video, we discussed the difference between minimalists and maximalists on how they view the importance of sex differences. So here it's the debate about why those differences exist. So, and here we have debate between like social and biological proponents of considering those factors as the most important. So conclusion, brief conclusion. So gender is a complex term, implies psychological, behavioral, social, and cultural aspects of being male or female. Though probably the definition of gender will change and already changing, and words male and female will extinct, and we will use something more detailed. So views on gender changed a lot during the last decades, including just literally last decade. Modern research implies that there are many genders and gender identities, whereas initially researchers thought about like gender in binary way. So gender identity is a personal sense of one's own gender. Gender identity should be considered separately from sexual orientation, and there are many possible combinations of sex, gender identities, and sexual orientations. So be careful with that. It actually creates several dozens of possible combinations, including very typical and very rare ones. Thank you.